11 Burger King's true horror stories that will keep you awake in the night. Welcome back to Horror Vault Channel. Today, I am going to share with you 11 most disturbing and bizarre true horror stories related to Burger King and McDonald's fast food restaurants that have happened with its employees or customers in the past. If you like these stories and want to watch our new upcoming videos, then do subscribe to Horror Vault. So without further delay, let us delve deep into these stories. Story 1. The Stalker at McDonald. My name is Julia, and this story is one I've tried to bury deep in my mind. But no matter how hard I try, it claws its way back into my thoughts. It happened when I was 18, working my first job at a McDonald's in my small town. I was young, naive, and thought the world was mostly a safe place. That belief shattered one evening during a shift that still sends chills down my spine. It was a busy Friday evening, the kind where the line of customers seemed endless. I worked the front counter, taking orders and handing out food with a practiced smile. Among the sea of faces that night, one man stood out. He was in his mid-30s, with unkempt hair and a thin frame. When it was his turn to order, he didn't ask for food. Instead, he leaned closer to the counter and asked for my phone number. I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the unexpected request. "I'm sorry," I said politely but firmly. "I can't do that." His face darkened with disappointment, but he didn't argue. He simply turned and walked out of the restaurant without ordering anything. I shrugged it off as just another awkward encounter, something every woman faces at some point. The next evening, around 8 p.m., the man returned. The dinner rush had passed, and the restaurant was quieter now. He approached the counter again, but this time his demeanor was different. Nervous, almost apologetic. "I wanted to say sorry for yesterday," he said, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I nodded politely, hoping this would be the end of it. "It's fine," I said quickly. "Can I get you something to eat?" But instead of ordering food, he asked for my number again. "I'm sorry," I repeated firmly. "I can't give you my number." His face twisted with frustration as he muttered something under his breath and stormed out of the restaurant once more. My co-workers noticed my unease and asked if everything was okay. I brushed it off, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. The watcher, 2 days later, during another evening shift, I spotted him again, but this time, he didn't approach the counter. Instead, he sat at a table in the back corner of the restaurant. He didn't order anything. He just sat there, staring at me. I tried to focus on my work and ignore him, but his presence made my skin crawl. Every time I glanced in his direction, his eyes were fixed on me like a predator watching its prey. Hours passed, and he remained seated in that same spot until my shift ended at 10 p.m. When I finally clocked out and stepped into the parking lot to head home, I felt a wave of relief when I didn't see him anywhere. The chase. The following weekend brought another late-night shift. By now, I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted about the man, that maybe he was just socially awkward and harmless. That illusion shattered when my shift ended that night. It was nearly midnight when I walked out into the dimly lit parking lot toward my car. The air was cold and still, and most of the other employees had already left for the night. As I fumbled with my keys near my car door, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around quickly, my heart sank as I saw him. The man from before, walking toward me with purpose in his stride. "Julia," he called out softly but insistently. Panic surged through me as I realized he must have waited outside for hours until my shift ended. Without thinking twice, I turned and bolted toward my car door. "Wait!" he shouted behind me as his footsteps quickened into a run. Fight or flight. My hands trembled as I unlocked my car door and jumped inside just as he reached me. Before I could lock the door, he grabbed the handle and tried to yank it open. "Please," he pleaded through the window. "Just talk to me." Adrenaline coursed through me as I reached into my bag and pulled out a small canister of pepper spray, a gift from my older sister who always worried about my safety. Without hesitation, I rolled down the window just enough to aim and sprayed him directly in the face. He screamed in pain and stumbled backward, clutching his eyes as tears streamed down his cheeks. Seizing the opportunity, I slammed the door shut and locked it before starting my car and speeding out of the parking lot. As soon as I reached a safe distance from the restaurant, I pulled over and called 911 to report what had happened. The police arrived at McDonald's shortly after, but found no sign of him. He had fled into the night. For weeks afterward, every shadow felt like him lurking nearby. Every unfamiliar face made me jump with fear. The police assured me they would keep an eye on things around town, but admitted there wasn't much they could do unless they caught him in the act again. I never saw him after that night. Whether because he left town or simply decided to leave me alone remains a mystery. Reflection. Looking back on that experience now feels surreal, like something out of a horror movie rather than real life. But it taught me an important lesson. Trust your instincts and never underestimate how far someone might go when their obsession turns dangerous. Even now, years later, I still carry pepper spray everywhere I go, just in case another nightmare decides to step out of the shadows again. Story 2. The Haunting of Burger King. My name is Daniel, and this is a story I've never told anyone, not fully at least. It happened 5 years ago when I was working as a night manager at a Burger King in my hometown. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of college, and trying to make ends meet while figuring out what to do with my life. The job was supposed to be temporary, but what I experienced there has stayed with me ever since. It started on a quiet Tuesday night. The dinner rush had come and gone, and the restaurant was nearly empty. The only sounds were the faint hum of the kitchen equipment and the occasional rustle of paper as I sorted through receipts at the front counter. Maria, one of our cooks, was in the back prepping ingredients for the next day. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard it, a faint giggle. It was soft but unmistakable, like that of a child. My heart skipped a beat. We were supposed to be alone in the restaurant. I looked up from my work and scanned the dining area, but it was empty. Maria, I called out nervously. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" she replied from the kitchen. I shook my head and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The shadow in the storage room. A week later, I was closing up for the night when it happened again. This time, I was in the storage room organizing inventory. The room was dimly lit, with shelves stacked high with boxes of frozen fries and burger patties. As I reached for a box on the top shelf, I felt it, a presence behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just as I let out a shaky laugh at my own paranoia, something caught my eye, a shadow darting across the far wall. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stepped out into the hallway leading back to the kitchen and saw nothing unusual. But as I turned to head back to the storage room, I felt a cold breeze brush past me. Impossible in a building with no open windows or doors. Maria's experience. The next day, Maria came to me looking pale and shaken. "Daniel," she said quietly, "something's wrong with this place." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated before continuing. "Last night after you left, I stayed late to finish prepping for breakfast. While I was chopping lettuce in the kitchen, I felt like someone was watching me. When I turned around, there he was." "Who?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "A man," she whispered. "He was standing at the end of the kitchen near the freezer. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me." "What did he look like?" I pressed. Maria shook her head. "I don't know his face. It didn't look right. It was empty." The little girl. Things escalated quickly after that night. Employees began reporting strange occurrences. Cups flying off counters without explanation, utensils clattering to the floor when no one was nearby, and voices calling their names from empty rooms. But what disturbed me most were the sightings of a little girl. Luis, our janitor, came to me one evening looking visibly shaken. "I saw her," he said simply. Saw who? I asked. The girl, he replied. She was hiding behind one of the soda machines in the dining area. When I went to check, she wasn't there. At first, I thought Luis might have been mistaken. Maybe he saw a shadow or imagined it after hearing Maria's story. But then Clara quit after an encounter of her own. She had been alone in the employee locker room, getting ready to leave, when she saw the girl's reflection in the mirror behind her. When she turned around, there was no one there, but she swore she felt someone breathing down her neck. The breaking point. One night, after weeks of strange occurrences and growing tension among staff, I decided to stay late and get to the bottom of whatever was happening, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my phone for company. I waited until everyone else had gone home before heading into the storage room, where most of the activity seemed to occur. The air inside felt colder than usual, as if something unseen had sucked all warmth from the space. As I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight flickered and then went out completely. Great, I muttered under my breath as darkness enveloped me. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps shuffling across the floor behind me. Who's there? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. And then he appeared. Standing just a few feet away was a man, tall and gaunt with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. His clothes were tattered and stained as if he'd been wearing them for decades. He raised one hand slowly and pointed toward a corner of the room, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. I followed his gesture and found an old metal box hidden beneath some crates. Inside were dusty photographs and newspaper clippings detailing a robbery that had taken place at this very location decades ago, back when it wasn't a Burger King but an independent diner. The man in front of me had been killed during that robbery, shot by police while trying to escape through this very storage room. The cleansing. The next morning, armed with this new information, I approached our district manager and convinced him to bring in someone who could help, a local priest known for performing blessings on haunted properties. When Father Gabriel arrived later that week, he performed a cleansing ritual throughout the restaurant, while reciting prayers meant to release trapped spirits from their earthly bonds. As he worked his way through each room, sprinkling holy water and burning sage, the atmosphere seemed to lighten noticeably until finally reaching its climax in front of where we had found that old box in storage earlier last week. Since then, peace returned. No more shadows lingered nor whispers haunted halls nightly anymore. Story 3. The Creature in the Play Area. My name is Ryan, and this is a story I've never been able to shake. It happened when I was 7 years old, during a late-night visit to a Burger King with my family. At that age, fast food was a treat, something my parents used to bribe my sister and me into behaving during long car rides. But that night, what happened in the play area changed the way I saw those brightly colored tunnels and slides forever. The play area. It was late, probably close to 10 p.m., and the restaurant was nearly empty. My parents had ordered our food and were sitting at a table near the window while my sister and I raced toward the play area. The structure was massive, with twisting slides, tunnels, and climbing platforms that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was my favorite part of going to Burger King. We were the only kids there that night, which made it even better. No one to fight over the best spots or rush us through the slides. My sister quickly climbed to the top level while I crawled through one of the lower tunnels. The plastic walls glowed faintly from the dim lights outside, casting long shadows that flickered as I moved. As I crawled deeper into the maze of tunnels, I started to feel uneasy. The air inside felt heavier than usual, and every sound, my sister's laughter above me or the muffled voices of my parents, seemed distant, almost muted. Still, I pushed forward, determined to explore every inch of the play area before our food arrived. The first sighting. I had just turned a corner in one of the tunnels when I saw it, a shape in the shadows ahead of me. At first, I thought it was another kid who had somehow snuck into the play area without me noticing. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it wasn't a kid at all. It looked like a dog at first glance, its body low to the ground with pointed ears and a long snout. But something about it was wrong. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like it didn't quite know how to use its limbs properly. And then it turned its head toward me. Its eyes glinted in the faint light, reflecting an eerie yellow glow. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of sharp teeth that didn't belong on any dog I'd ever seen. My heart pounded in my chest as it began to crawl toward me, not like an animal but like a person on all fours. I froze, unable to move or even scream as it crept closer. Finally, my instincts kicked in, and I scrambled backward as fast as I could. My knees scraped against the rough plastic floor of the tunnel as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Behind me, I heard it pick up speed, its claws or fingers scraping against the tunnel walls as it chased me. I burst out of the tunnel into one of the open climbing areas and immediately climbed up to the next level where my sister was sitting. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing my pale face and trembling hands. "There's something in there," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. She laughed nervously. "Stop trying to scare me. I'm not joking." I insisted. "There's something down there." Before she could respond, we both heard it. The sound of something moving through the tunnels below us. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, a soft scraping noise that sent chills down my spine. The confrontation. We huddled together at the top level of the play area, too scared to move. The sounds grew louder as whatever was in the tunnels climbed closer and closer. Finally, we saw it emerge into one of the open areas below us. In full view now under the dim glow of an overhead light, it looked even more grotesque than before. Its body was thin and wiry, covered in patches of matted fur that seemed to cling unnaturally to its skin. Its limbs were too long for its body, bending at odd angles as it moved. It tilted its head upward and sniffed the air before letting out a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing my sister's hand. We scrambled toward one of the slides that spiraled down to ground level. Behind us, we heard it give chase again, its movements faster now, more frantic as if it knew we were trying to escape. We slid down together in a blur of panic and hit the ground running toward our parents' table, telling our parents, "Mom! Dad!" I shouted as we skidded to a stop beside them. "What's wrong?" my dad asked, looking up from his burger with concern. "There's something in there," I cried, pointing toward the play area. My mom frowned. "What do you mean? Another kid?" "No," I insisted. "It's not a kid. It's something else." My dad sighed and stood up. "All right, let's take a look." He walked over to the entrance of the play area while my mom tried to calm us down. We watched anxiously as he peered into one of the tunnels before climbing partway inside. "There's nothing here," he called back after a moment. "But we saw it," my sister protested. He shook his head as he climbed back out. "Probably just your imagination." We left shortly after that. I think my parents could tell how shaken we were even if they didn't believe our story. For weeks afterward, I refused to go near any play areas at fast food restaurants or anywhere else for that matter. Even now, years later, I can still see its glowing eyes and hear those scraping noises whenever I think about that night. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run when we did, if we had stayed frozen in fear just a moment longer. Whatever that thing was, animal or otherwise, I hope I never see anything like it again for as long as I live. Story 4. The Midnight Shift at KFC. My name is Clara, and this is a story I've kept buried for years. It happened in the summer of 2019, during my final year of college. I worked part-time as a cashier at a KFC in my small hometown. The job was unremarkable, serving fried chicken to customers and closing up late at night. But one night changed everything, leaving scars that time has yet to heal. The strangers. It was a humid summer night, and the restaurant was eerily quiet. My shift was almost over, and I was counting the register's cash when the door swung open with an unsettling force. 2 teenagers walked in. One had fiery red hair and pale skin, while the other had long, greasy hair tied into a messy bun. They looked no older than 16, their clothes filthy and their nails caked with dirt. The air around them carried a sour, metallic stench. The red-haired boy, let's call him Ethan, approached the counter with a cold smile. "A bucket of fried chicken, please," he said, sliding a crumpled $20 bill across the counter. His companion, Noah, remained silent but stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I told them to take a seat while I placed their order with Ralph, our night cook. As I walked into the kitchen, I whispered to Ralph about the odd pair. He chuckled dismissively. "Relax, Clara. They're just kids." But something about them felt wrong, dangerous even. The waiting game. When I returned to the dining area, Ethan and Noah weren't seated like I had suggested. Instead, they wandered aimlessly around the restaurant, their eyes scanning every corner as if they were casing the place. Ethan's gaze lingered too long on the security cameras. Eventually, they sat at a table near the counter and began whispering to each other in hushed tones. Though I couldn't catch much of their conversation, I heard Ethan call his companion by name, Noah. The silent boy unnerved me more than his talkative friend. His face bore faint scars like old knife wounds, and his piercing stare felt predatory. Suddenly, Noah stood up and walked out of the restaurant without explanation. Alarmed but trying not to show it, I asked Ethan where his friend had gone. "Bathroom," he replied with a crooked grin that didn't reach his eyes. I nodded stiffly and glanced toward the kitchen door, willing Ralph to hurry up with their order. The power cut. Minutes passed like hours before Ralph finally called out that their food was ready. Just as I stepped into the kitchen to grab it, the lights flickered and went out completely. My heart leaped into my throat as darkness enveloped the restaurant. This wasn't an ordinary power outage. The streetlights outside were still glowing brightly. Someone had deliberately turned off our breakers. I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight and took a cautious step forward when my shoe landed in something wet and sticky on the floor. The metallic tang of blood filled my nostrils as I shone my light downward. A dark red puddle spread across the tiles. "Ralph!" My voice trembled as I called out for him. There was no answer. Before I could process what was happening, Ethan appeared in front of me out of nowhere, holding something sharp, a knife glinting faintly in my flashlight's beam. His grin widened as he blocked my path to the back exit. I spun around to escape through another door, but froze when Noah emerged from the shadows behind me. He had been waiting there all along. "What do you want?" I stammered. Ethan chuckled darkly. "Just some cash from your register." My mind raced as they herded me back toward the front counter. Every instinct screamed at me to stay calm. One wrong move could turn this robbery into something far worse. When we reached the register, Noah shoved me forward roughly, causing me to hit my head against the marble countertop. Blood trickled down my forehead as tears blurred my vision. "Please," I begged through sobs. "Take what you want and leave." "Open it," Ethan barked impatiently. A desperate plan. The register was locked electronically, requiring access through our computer system, a fact that gave me an idea. "The register is automated," I lied shakily. "I need to turn on the computer to open it." Ethan narrowed his eyes suspiciously, but nodded after a moment's hesitation. "Fine," he growled, "but no funny business." Noah disappeared into the kitchen to restore power, while Ethan hovered over me menacingly with his knife still in hand. When the lights flickered back on moments later, Ethan ordered me to disable the security cameras before opening the register. Pretending to comply, I powered down the cameras, but secretly left one recording their every move. As soon as I unlocked the register and began loading cash into a bag for them, adrenaline surged through me. I wasn't going down without a fight. Turning tables. With all my strength, I swung the heavy cash drawer upward into Ethan's face. He stumbled backward with a startled cry as blood gushed from his nose. Seizing my chance, I grabbed my phone from his pocket and bolted toward Noah just as he re-entered from the kitchen doorway. Before he could react, I hurled hot fryer oil, something I had grabbed earlier during their initial confrontation, directly into his face. Noah screamed in agony as he collapsed onto the floor, clutching his blistering skin. With both attackers incapacitated, I locked myself in an office and called 911 while shaking uncontrollably. The police arrived within minutes and arrested Ethan and Noah without further incident. Ralph was found unconscious in the kitchen, but thankfully alive. They had knocked him out before cutting power to stage their robbery attempt. Though justice was served that night, it came at a cost. I never returned to KFC after that shift ended abruptly in terror. Even now, years later, I still wake up drenched in sweat from nightmares where those boys' faces loom over me in darkness. Story 5. The Secret Recipe. My name is Emily, and for years, I've carried the weight of this story. It's not something I like to think about, let alone talk about, but it's been clawing at the edges of my mind ever since it happened. 5 years ago, I worked at a KFC in my hometown. It was supposed to be a simple job, frying chicken, serving customers, and counting down the register at night. But what I discovered during my time there changed me forever. The first taste. It all started innocently enough. One night after a long shift, I brought home a box of leftover chicken. It was something we all did. Free food was one of the few perks of working there. As I sat on my couch eating, I noticed something strange. The chicken didn't taste like it usually did. There was a sweetness to it, almost floral, followed by a bitter aftertaste that left my tongue slightly numb. At first, I thought maybe the seasoning had gone bad or the oil hadn't been changed in time. But the next day at work, Jerry, one of my co-workers, mentioned it too. "Hey," he said while flipping chicken in the fryer. "Is it just me, or does the chicken taste different lately?" I nodded. "Yeah, I noticed it last night. It's weird. Maybe they changed the recipe," he shrugged. "You know how corporate is." But something about it didn't sit right with me. The customers change. Over the next few weeks, things got stranger. Regular customers started coming in more frequently, every day instead of once or twice a week. They weren't just ordering their usual meals either. They were buying entire buckets of chicken and devouring them in minutes. And then there were their appearances. Their faces grew pale and gaunt, with dark circles under their eyes and red blotches on their skin. They scratched at themselves constantly, leaving raw marks on their arms and necks. One night, during a particularly busy shift, we ran out of chicken before closing time. A man approached the counter, a regular customer who had been coming in almost daily, and asked for his usual bucket. "I'm sorry," I said hesitantly. "We're out of chicken for tonight." His bloodshot eyes widened in shock before narrowing with anger. "What do you mean you're out?" he growled. "I'm really sorry," I repeated nervously. "We'll have more tomorrow." But he wasn't listening anymore. He lunged at another customer who was holding a nearly full bucket of chicken and tried to grab a drumstick from her hand. She screamed and bit his arm so hard that blood splattered onto the floor. Chaos erupted as other customers joined in, fighting over scraps of chicken like wild animals. We retreated into the kitchen and called the police while locking ourselves inside. The discovery, after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with our restaurant, more than just an issue with seasoning or corporate policy changes. One evening after closing up, I decided to investigate. Our manager, Mr. Carter, had left early as usual, so I had the place to myself. While cleaning up near his office, I noticed a small vial tucked behind some paperwork on his desk. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up to examine it more closely. The label read Compound X. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't some ordinary spice or seasoning. It was something far more sinister. Before I could process what it meant, Mr. Carter walked into the office unexpectedly. "What are you doing?" he demanded sharply. I froze, hiding the vial behind my back. "Just cleaning up," I lied. His eyes narrowed suspiciously before he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good," he said slowly. "Make sure everything's spotless." Confrontation. That night haunted me as much as the strange behavior of our customers did. Determined to get answers, I stayed late again a few nights later when Mr. Carter was working late in his office. When I confronted him about Compound X, his demeanor shifted instantly, from calm and collected to cold and menacing. "You don't understand business," he sneered when I accused him of tampering with the food. "What are you putting in the chicken?" I demanded. He leaned back in his chair with an unsettling grin. "Just something to keep customers coming back." "You're poisoning them," I shouted. He stood up abruptly and slammed his hands on the desk, making me jump. "Do you know how much sales have increased since we started using that?" he hissed. I stared at him in disbelief as he continued ranting about profits and corporate success while completely ignoring the human cost of what he was doing. The breaking point. That same night, Jerry found out what was happening too, and together we decided we couldn't stay silent any longer. We contacted the police anonymously and provided them with evidence from Mr. Carter's office, including samples of Compound X that we'd managed to steal without him noticing. Within days, authorities raided our KFC location and shut it down for good after discovering traces of an illegal drug in our food supplies, a drug designed specifically to create dependency by altering brain chemistry over time. Mr. Carter disappeared before he could be arrested, and no one has seen or heard from him since then. Though justice was served in some ways, our restaurant closed permanently. Investigations revealed similar practices at other locations across multiple states. I still carry guilt for not speaking up sooner or noticing sooner what was happening around me every day at work. Even now, years later, I can still see those desperate faces clawing at each other over scraps of tainted chicken. Story 6. The Armed Stranger at Burger King. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of the night I came face to face with something that still haunts me to this day. It was supposed to be an ordinary shift at the Burger King where I worked part-time while saving up for college. But that night, I learned how quickly the mundane can turn into a nightmare. The quiet before the storm. It was a slow evening. One of those nights where the minutes dragged on endlessly. The restaurant was nearly empty, except for a couple of regulars seated near the windows. I was working the front counter, idly wiping it down while my co-worker, Mia, restocked supplies in the back. The hum of the kitchen equipment and the occasional shuffle of feet were the only sounds breaking the silence. At around 9:30 p.m., just half an hour before closing, the door swung open and a man walked in. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale and slick with sweat. He wore a faded hoodie and jeans that hung loosely on his frame. Something about him immediately felt off. He approached the counter slowly, his left hand pressed against his lower back as if he were hiding something. His movements were jittery, his eyes darting around the room like he was searching for something or someone. The order. When he reached the counter, I forced a polite smile and asked, "What can I get for you tonight?" For a moment, he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on me, unblinking, as if trying to decide whether I was worth talking to. Then he muttered, almost inaudibly, a number 2. I nodded and punched in his order. As I turned to grab his cup for a drink, I noticed him fidgeting with something under his hoodie. My stomach tightened as I realized he was gripping an object, a long, hard shape pressed against his side, which was a gun. The tension builds. I tried to stay calm as I handed him his cup and told him his food would be ready shortly. He didn't move to fill his drink. Instead, he stood at the counter, staring at me with those wild eyes. His hand never left whatever he was holding under his hoodie. Mia came out from the back just then, carrying a box of napkins. She froze when she saw him, but quickly composed herself and went about restocking the condiment station. I caught her eye and subtly shook my head. Our silence signaled that something wasn't right. The man's food came up on the tray after what felt like an eternity. He grabbed it without a word and walked to a table in the corner of the dining area. He sat with his back to the wall, facing the entire restaurant like he wanted to keep an eye on everyone. The stranger's behavior. Mia whispered to me from behind the counter, "What's wrong with him?" "I think he has a gun," I murmured back. Her eyes widened in fear, but she nodded silently and stepped into the kitchen to call our manager, who had already left for the night. Meanwhile, I kept glancing at the man out of the corner of my eye. He wasn't eating. Instead, he sat there staring at his tray as if deep in thought, or struggling with some inner conflict. Occasionally, he would glance toward us at the counter or out the windows into the dark parking lot. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The confrontation, at around 9:50 p.m., just 10 minutes before closing. The man suddenly stood up. My heart raced as he walked toward us again, leaving his untouched food behind. This time, there was no mistaking it. His hand gripped the handle of a gun tucked into his waistband. He stopped at the counter and leaned in close enough that I could smell sweat and something metallic. Blood? His voice was low but firm when he spoke. "Give me all the cash from your register," he said. My hands shook as I opened the register and began pulling out bills. Mia stood frozen beside me, her face pale as a ghost. "Hurry up," he snapped, glancing nervously over his shoulder toward the windows. I handed him a wad of cash, hoping it would be enough to satisfy him so he'd leave without hurting anyone. But instead of walking away, he lingered there for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing as if debating whether to do something worse. The escape. Just then, headlights flashed across the windows as a car pulled into the drive-through lane. The man stiffened and cursed under his breath before shoving the money into his pocket and bolting toward the door. As soon as he was outside, Mia locked it behind him while I grabbed my phone to call 911. We watched through the glass as he ran across the parking lot and disappeared into an alleyway behind some buildings. The police arrived within minutes and took our statements. They searched the area but didn't find him that night. We later learned from officers that similar robberies had occurred at other fast food restaurants in nearby towns, and they believed it was all connected to one man who had yet to be caught. For weeks after that night, every shadow outside Burger King made my heart race. Every customer who walked through those doors felt like a potential threat. Eventually, I quit my job. I couldn't handle living in constant fear anymore. Even now, years later, I still find myself scanning every room I enter for exits and suspicious faces. That night taught me how fragile safety can be, and how quickly normalcy can shatter when danger walks through your door holding a gun. Story 7. The Haunted Storage Room. My name is Michael, and for years, I've tried to make sense of what happened during my time working at Burger King. I was 20 years old, fresh out of high school, and this was my first real job. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me a sense of independence. What I didn't expect was that the job would come with something far darker than the smell of grease and the monotony of fast food service. This story isn't just about what I saw. It's about what we all saw, and it's about a man who never left. It started on a quiet Tuesday night. The dinner rush had ended, and the restaurant was nearly empty. I was in the back office counting cash while Maria, one of our cooks, prepped ingredients for the next day. Luis, our janitor, was mopping the dining area. Around 10 p.m., Maria came into the office looking pale. "Michael," she said hesitantly, "I think someone's in the storage room." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "I heard footsteps," she whispered. But when I checked, no one was there. I laughed nervously. Probably just the building settling or something. But as soon as she left, I felt it too. A chill that seemed to seep into the office from the hallway leading to the storage room. I shook it off and went back to counting cash. That night, as I locked up and walked past the storage room on my way out, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving behind the frosted glass window on the door. But when I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. The shadow in the storage room. A week later, things escalated. It was another late shift. Maria had already left for the night, and Luis was finishing up his cleaning duties. I decided to restock some supplies before closing up. As I entered the storage room, a wave of cold air hit me. It was freezing inside, far colder than it should have been. I grabbed a box of cups and turned to leave when I heard it. A faint whispering sound coming from deeper within the room. "Hello." I called out nervously. No response. I stepped closer to where the sound had come from and saw something that made my blood run cold. A chair in the corner of the room that hadn't been there before. It was an old wooden chair with peeling paint and deep scratches on its surface. As I stared at it, trying to figure out how it had gotten there, I felt a presence behind me. Whipping around, I saw nothing but shadows dancing on the walls. I bolted out of the storage room and didn't go back for the rest of my shift. Maria's story. The next day, Maria pulled me aside during our lunch break. "Michael," she said quietly, "I saw him." "Saw who?" I asked. "The man," she replied. "Last night, after you left." She told me she had stayed late to finish some prep work when she felt someone watching her. When she turned around, she saw a man standing at the end of the kitchen near the freezer. He was tall and thin with hollow eyes and tattered clothes. "He didn't say anything," Maria said, her voice trembling. "He just stood there, staring at me." "What did you do?" I asked. "I ran," she admitted. "When I looked back, he was gone." The little girl. Maria wasn't the only one having strange experiences. Luis came to me a few days later with his own story. "I saw her," he said simply. "Saw who?" I asked. "The little girl," he replied. Luis explained that he had been cleaning near the soda machines in the dining area when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning toward it, he saw a small girl peeking out from behind one of the machines. She had long dark hair and wore a white dress that looked old-fashioned. "When I went to check, she wasn't there," Luis said. "But I swear, she was real." The breaking point. By now, everyone on staff had experienced something strange. Footsteps in empty hallways, objects moving on their own, disembodied voices calling their names. But nothing prepared us for what happened next. One night, Clara, one of our cashiers, was alone in the employee locker room getting ready to leave when she saw something in the mirror. A man standing behind her. She spun around but found no one there. Shaking with fear, she grabbed her things and ran out of the restaurant without even clocking out. The next day, Clara quit without explanation. The discovery. Determined to get answers, I decided to stay late one night after everyone else had gone home. Armed with a flashlight and my phone for company, I ventured into the storage room where most of these events seemed to occur. As soon as I stepped inside, that familiar chill washed over me again. My flashlight flickered, as if struggling against some unseen force. Then I saw him. The man Maria had described, sitting in that old wooden chair in the corner of the room. His head hung low as if in sorrow or shame. "Who are you?" I whispered shakily. He didn't respond but slowly raised his hand and pointed toward an old metal box tucked beneath one of the shelves. I hesitated before approaching it, but eventually opened it to find dusty photographs and newspaper clippings detailing a robbery that had taken place at this very location decades ago. Back when it wasn't a Burger King but an independent diner. The man in front of me had been killed during that robbery, shot by police while trying to escape through this very storage room. The next morning, armed with this new information, we convinced our manager to bring in someone who could help. A local priest known for performing blessings on haunted properties. Father Gabriel arrived later that week and performed a cleansing ritual throughout the restaurant, while reciting prayers meant to release trapped spirits from their earthly bonds. As he worked his way through each room, sprinkling holy water and burning sage, the atmosphere seemed to lighten noticeably until finally reaching its climax in front of where we had found that old box in storage earlier last week. Since then, the haunting stopped. No more shadows lingered nor whispers haunted halls nightly anymore. But even now, years later, I can't shake off memories burned deep within consciousness forevermore. Story 8. The Night Shift Haunting. My name is Alex, and for years, I've tried to forget what happened during those long, lonely nights at the Burger King where I used to work. It's been over a decade, but the memories remain vivid, etched into my mind like scars. I was young then, 22 years old, working as a night manager to save up for college. The job was simple enough. Close up the restaurant, count the cash, and make sure everything was ready for the morning crew. But one night changed everything. The first signs. It started as a normal shift. The dinner rush had come and gone, leaving the restaurant eerily quiet. My only co-worker that night, Maria, was in the back prepping ingredients for the next day. I was at the front counter organizing receipts when I heard it. A faint ping from the drive-thru alert system. I glanced at the monitor, but saw nothing. The lane was empty. Thinking it might be a glitch, I shrugged it off and went back to my work. But then it happened again, another ping. This time, I walked to the window to check for myself. The drive-thru lane was completely deserted. "Maria," I called out nervously. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" she replied from the kitchen. I shook my head and laughed it off, convincing myself it was just a technical issue. But deep down, something felt wrong. The shadow in the freezer. A few nights later, things escalated. It was nearing midnight, and Maria had already left for the night. I was alone, finishing up my closing duties when I decided to check the freezer inventory. As I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. Not from the cold air, but from an overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I turned around quickly, but saw nothing. Just rows of frozen patties and fries stacked neatly on shelves. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement, a shadow darting across the far wall. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I backed out of the freezer slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I locked the door behind me, I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maria's encounter. The next morning, Maria came in looking pale and shaken. "Alex," she said quietly, "I think there's something wrong with this place." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated before continuing. "Last night after you left, I stayed late to finish some prep work. While I was chopping lettuce in the kitchen, I felt someone watching me." "Watching you? Who?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know." When I turned around, there was a man standing near the freezer door. A man? What did he look like? My stomach churned at her words. "I couldn't see his face," she whispered. "It was like it wasn't there." The little girl. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences became more frequent. Employees reported hearing footsteps in empty hallways or feeling cold spots in random areas of the restaurant. But what disturbed me most were the sightings of a little girl. Luis, our janitor, came to me one evening looking visibly shaken. "I saw her," he said simply. "Saw who?" I asked. "The girl," he replied. "She was hiding behind one of the soda machines in the dining area." "What did she look like?" "She looked normal," he said hesitantly. "But her eyes, they weren't right. At first, I thought Luis might have been mistaken. Maybe he saw a reflection or a shadow, but then Clara quit after an encounter of her own. She had been alone in the employee locker room getting ready to leave when she saw the girl's reflection in a mirror behind her. When she turned around, there was no one there, but she swore she felt someone breathing down her neck. The breaking point. One night, after weeks of strange occurrences and growing tension among staff, I decided to stay late and get to the bottom of whatever was happening, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my phone for company. I waited until everyone else had gone home before heading into the storage room, where most of these events seemed to originate. The air inside felt colder than usual, as if something unseen had sucked all warmth from the space. As I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight flickered and then went out completely. "Great," I muttered under my breath as darkness enveloped me. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps shuffling across the floor behind me. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer, and then he appeared. Standing just a few feet away was a man, tall and gaunt with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. His clothes were tattered and stained as if he'd been wearing them for decades. He raised one hand slowly and pointed toward a corner of the room. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I followed his gesture and found an old metal box hidden beneath some crates. Inside were dusty photographs and newspaper clippings detailing a robbery that had taken place at this very location decades ago. Back when it wasn't a Burger King but an independent diner. The man in front of me had been killed during that robbery, shot by police while trying to escape through this very storage room. The cleansing. The next day at work felt surreal, as if everyone knew what had happened but couldn't say it aloud, including me. Armed with this new information, our manager contacted a local priest known for performing blessings on haunted properties. When Father Gabriel arrived later that week, he performed a cleansing ritual throughout the restaurant while reciting prayers meant to release trapped spirits from their earthly bonds. As he worked his way through each room, sprinkling holy water and burning sage, the atmosphere seemed to lighten noticeably until finally reaching its climax in front of where we had found that old box in storage earlier last week. Since then, peace returned. No more shadows lingered nor whispers haunted halls nightly anymore. But even now, years later, I still can't shake off memories burned deep within consciousness forevermore. Story 9. The King in the Shadows. A first-person horror story. My name is Lucas, and I've always considered myself a pretty grounded guy. I've seen my fair share of weirdness working the graveyard shift at a Burger King in a quiet suburban town. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the nightmare that unfolded one spring night in 2025. I'd been working at this Burger King for about 6 months. The night shifts weren't bad. Fewer customers meant less stress, and the solitude suited me. My apartment was only a 15-minute walk away, so I didn't mind getting home late. It was a simple life, but it worked for me. That night started like any other. The dining area was closed, and I was manning the drive-thru alone while my co-worker, Jake, handled the kitchen. Jake was a good guy, always cracking jokes to keep things light. Around 9 p.m., we got hit with a small rush of cars, but by midnight, the place was dead quiet again. I leaned against the counter, scrolling through my phone to pass the time, when I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A car pulled up to the drive-thru speaker. I put on my headset and greeted them with my usual monotone cheerfulness. "Welcome to Burger King. May I take your order?" What came next wasn't an order, but a voice, a deep, theatrical tone that sent a shiver down my spine. 30 Whoppers, the man said. I blinked. 30? Did you mean 3? No, he replied firmly. 30 Whoppers. Make them now. I glanced at Jake through the kitchen window. He raised an eyebrow but shrugged. It wasn't our job to question customers' eccentricities. Okay, I said hesitantly. 30 Whoppers coming right up. The car rolled forward to the window, and that's when I saw him. A man dressed as a Burger King mascot. His costume was immaculate. A golden crown perched atop his head, a velvet cape draped over his shoulders, and a plastic mask molded into that infamous grin. But there was something off about him. The way he sat unnaturally still, his gloved hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. He handed me $150 in cash, without saying another word, and parked his car in one of the spaces outside. As Jake and I worked on his massive order, I kept stealing glances at him through the window. He'd set up his phone on his dashboard and appeared to be recording himself. When we finally finished assembling his mountain of Whoppers, I carried them out to his car on 2 trays. He didn't thank me or even acknowledge my presence. Just started devouring the burgers one by one while staring into his phone's camera. Must be filming some kind of mukbang, Jake muttered when I returned inside. Yeah, I replied uneasily. Or he's just insane. By 1 a.m., we were ready to close up for the night. The mascot had eaten about 10 burgers before passing out in his car with ketchup smeared across his mask like blood. Jake and I debated whether to wake him up or just leave him there, but eventually decided it wasn't our problem. I clocked out and called an Uber. I didn't feel like walking home after that unsettling encounter. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was nearly 2 a.m. Exhausted, I took a quick shower and collapsed into bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise, a faint tapping sound coming from my front door. My heart sank as dread washed over me. It's probably nothing, I told myself. Just some drunk neighbor. But then came a voice, a low whisper that sent chills down my spine. Open the door. I froze. That voice. It was him. Open the door, he repeated, louder this time. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. As I waited for the operator to pick up, the tapping turned into pounding. Violent thuds that rattled the doorframe. 911, what's your emergency? Came a calm voice on the other end of the line. There's someone trying to break into my apartment. I whispered frantically. He followed me home from work. He's dressed as. Before I could finish, there was a deafening crash as the door burst open. The Burger King mascot stood in my doorway, holding a crowbar in one hand and pointing at me with the other. Have it your way, he growled before lunging toward me. I scrambled off the bed and bolted for the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me just as he reached it. My heart pounded in my chest as he began smashing against it with terrifying force. Open up, he roared between blows. You can't hide forever. Desperate for something, anything, to defend myself with, I remember my grandfather's old handgun stashed under the sink cabinet. My hands shook as I pulled it out and checked that it was loaded. Please, I begged through tears as he continued battering down the door. Just leave me alone. But he didn't stop. Not until his head finally broke through a hole in the wood like something out of The Shining. His mask twisted grotesquely as he grinned at me through jagged splinters. Here's Johnny, he cackled maniacally. Without thinking, I raised the gun and fired. The sound was deafening in such a small space, but it worked. The man stumbled back with a grunt of pain before collapsing onto my bedroom floor. When police arrived minutes later, they found me huddled in the bathroom, clutching the gun like a lifeline. The officers assured me that I'd acted in self-defense, that this man had been terrorizing fast food workers across town for weeks before targeting me specifically. Even so, I couldn't shake what happened that night, or forget how close I came to becoming another victim of the King in the Shadows. Story 10. The Skeleton Companion, a first-person horror story. My name is Ethan, and this story is one that haunts me to this day. It was a quiet Monday night in January 2025, the kind of night where the world fell asleep. I worked the night shift at a Burger King near my apartment, a 5-minute walk that made late nights manageable. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and the solitude of the night shift suited my introverted nature. Or so I thought. That night began like any other. I sat behind the counter, scrolling through YouTube videos to pass the time. The dining area was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the fryer in the kitchen. Then I heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel as a car pulled into the drive-through lane. I quickly set my phone aside and put on my best customer service voice. Welcome to Burger King. May I take your order? The car rolled up to the window, and I saw him for the first time. He wore a loud Hawaiian shirt that clashed with his pale complexion. But it wasn't his appearance that froze me. It was his passenger. Sitting in the seat beside him was a skeleton, dressed in a floral dress and a wide-brimmed hat, as though ready for a summer picnic. Yeah, we're hungry, he said casually, as if nothing about the situation was odd. He turned to the skeleton with a grin that made my skin crawl. What do you have tonight, darling? I stood there, stunned. Was this some kind of prank? But his behavior didn't seem performative. It felt disturbingly genuine. He whispered to the skeleton, laughed softly as if she told him a joke, then turned back to me. A Whopper for me and a cheeseburger for Jenny, he said. I hesitated but nodded, deciding not to question it. Sure thing. I handed him his order and watched as he drove off into the night. My hands trembled slightly as I returned to my seat by the counter. What had just happened Was he insane? Dangerous? I tried to shake it off. After all, working nights meant dealing with all kinds of strange people. The man became a regular after that night. Every few days, he'd pull into the drive-thru around midnight with Jenny by his side. He always wore that same Hawaiian shirt, always ordered a Whopper for himself and a cheeseburger for her. Over time, I grew desensitized to his oddity. He wasn't hurting anyone, just another eccentric in a world full of them. But one stormy night changed everything. It was raining heavily when his car pulled into the drive-thru lane again. As usual, he placed his order, a Whopper for him and a cheeseburger for Jenny. But this time, there was a problem. Sir, I said cautiously, we're out of cheese tonight. Would you like to substitute it with something else? His face darkened instantly. Jenny loves cheese, he said slowly, as though explaining something obvious to a child. I understand that. I replied as politely as I could. But we're short on cheese tonight. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity before breaking into a grin that sent chills down my spine. Oh, I see what's going on here, he said softly. You're jealous of Jenny. What? I stammered. You want me all to yourself, he continued, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. Isn't that right? I couldn't hold back anymore. Look, I snapped, Jenny is just a skeleton. She's not real. Maybe if you spent less time pretending she's your girlfriend, you could find someone who actually exists. The words were out before I could stop them. His face turned pale as his grin vanished. Without another word, he drove off into the stormy night. A week passed without any sign of him or Jenny. At first, I felt relieved. Maybe my outburst had scared him off for good. But then guilt began to creep in. Had I been too harsh? Was it my fault if something had happened to him? When he finally returned one night, something was different. Jenny was gone. He pulled up alone and ordered just a Whopper for himself. His demeanor was subdued. He barely looked at me as he handed over the cash and took his food. But instead of driving away after receiving his order, he parked across the street and got out of his car. He sat on the hood of his vehicle, in plain view of the drive-thru window, and began eating his burger while staring directly at me. There was something unhinged about the way he ate. Mayo dripping from his mouth like blood, ketchup smeared across his face. And he never broke eye contact with me once. That image stayed with me long after he left. Weeks went by without further incidents until one fateful night when everything spiraled out of control. It was just past midnight when his car pulled up again, but this time there was someone else in the passenger seat. A young woman who appeared heavily intoxicated. As soon as he rolled down his window, I caught the sickly sweet smell of alcohol wafting from her direction. She slumped against her seatbelt like a rag doll, while he grinned at me with that same unsettling smile. "This is my real girlfriend," he announced proudly. "See? She's real." My stomach churned as dread washed over me like ice water. Before I could respond or call for help discreetly, he reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a wrench. "See for yourself," he shouted before turning toward her and raising the wrench high above his head. "No!" I screamed, but it was too late. He brought it down with brutal force again and again while screaming hysterically, "She's real. She's real." Blood splattered across the inside of the car windows as her lifeless body slumped forward under his relentless assault. The sound of sirens filled the air moments later as police cars screeched into view. But by then it was too late for her, or for me. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital bed with my boss sitting beside me. He told me they'd arrested him on charges of first-degree murder, but assured me justice would be served. Yet even now, as I sit here recounting these events, I can't shake one question from my mind. Did I provoke him? Could I have prevented this tragedy if only I'd acted differently? All I know is that night will haunt me forever. A chilling reminder that sometimes monsters wear human faces, and they might just pull up to your window when you least expect it. Story 11. The King's Last Prank. A first-person horror story. My name is Russell. And this is the story of the night I stopped believing in second chances. It was the kind of horror you never imagined could happen to you, until it does. I replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times, but no matter how much I try to make sense of it, the outcome remains the same. I had been working at Burger King for about 6 months, mostly night shifts. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep me afloat while I figured out what to do with my life. My coworker Jeff and I were both new hires, and we got along well. Jeff was the kind of guy who could make even the dullest shifts bearable with his jokes and pranks. Then there was Bob. Bob was older, a lifer at Burger King, and he gave everyone the creeps. He had this unsettling way of staring at you, as if he knew something you didn't. And the way he smirked and winked at me sometimes, let's just say it made me avoid being alone with him whenever possible. Our boss must have noticed Bob's effect on people because one day he reassigned him to a different role, dressing up as the Burger King mascot to wave at customers outside. It was meant to keep him away from the kitchen and customers, but honestly, seeing him in that oversized mask and cape only made him more unnerving. It was a Friday night when everything unraveled. Jeff and I were working the late shift together, just the two of us after the dining area closed at 10 p.m. The night had been slow, typical for our quiet corner town, and we were killing time between drive-through orders. Jeff had just gone to use the bathroom when I heard the back door creak open. I glanced up from my phone, expecting to see Jeff returning. Instead, I saw him, the Burger King mascot, standing in the doorway. The crown glinted under the fluorescent lights, and that frozen grin on the mask seemed almost alive in the dimly lit kitchen. "Bob," I asked hesitantly. The mascot didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, holding something in his hand, a large kitchen knife. My stomach dropped. "Bob, what are you doing?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Still no response. He took a step forward, raising the knife slightly as he moved closer. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. "Stop!" I shouted. "Stay back." He didn't stop. I grabbed a knife from the counter next to me and held it out defensively. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on it. "Bob," I pleaded, "this isn't funny. Put down the knife." He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my words, but then he lunged at me. I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding his swipe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Desperate, I swung my knife wildly in front of me to keep him at bay. "Help!" I screamed toward the bathroom door. "Jeff, somebody help me." But no one came. The mascot advanced again, his movements slow but deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. My back hit the counter behind me. I was cornered. Then fate intervened in a way I never could have predicted. He slipped. There was lettuce scattered across the floor from earlier in the night, a mess neither Jeff nor I had bothered to clean up, and his foot slid out from under him as he stepped forward. He hit the ground hard, and the knife flew from his hand, skidding across the floor out of reach. I didn't think, I just acted. I jumped on top of him and raised my knife high above my head. "This is self-defense," I shouted, more for myself than for anyone else. And then I brought it down once, twice, 3 times, plunging it into his chest through the thick fabric of his costume. Each time I struck, I told myself it was necessary, that it was him or me. When he finally stopped moving, I collapsed onto the floor beside him, gasping for breath. My hands were sticky with blood, or what I thought was blood, until I noticed something strange. There wasn't nearly as much as there should have been. That's when it hit me. What if this wasn't Bob? With trembling hands, I reached for his mask and pulled it off, and froze in horror as Jeff's face stared back at me. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." His eyes fluttered open briefly as blood bubbled from his lips. "It was just a prank," he choked out before going still forever. The realization hit me like a freight train. Jeff had been trying to scare me, to pull one of his stupid pranks, and now he was dead because of it. I sat there on the cold tile floor for what felt like hours, unable to move or think or breathe. When the police arrived, called by a neighbor who'd heard my screams, they found me still clutching the knife in one hand and Jeff's mask in the other. They ruled it self-defense after hearing my story. There was no way for me to know it wasn't Bob under that mask. But even though they let me go free, I've never truly escaped that night. Now every time I close my eyes, I see Jeff's face staring back at me, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and betrayal, as he whispered those final words. It was just a prank. And every time I hear someone laugh or joke about pranks gone wrong, all I can think is this: some things aren't funny. And that's the end, guys. Don't forget to subscribe to Horror Vault to keep listening to our new and unique historical horror stories. I will see you in the next video.